Alright guys, we had this question a couple of times come up, is how do we actually get our Christian Bible? So I did this little PowerPoint. Hopefully this will help give a good understanding. We're going to start with the basics though, as far as the Bible is concerned. The word Bible comes from a Latin word called biblios, which basically means books. Okay, simple enough. So when you say the word Bible, you're saying a collection of books. It's not just a single book, it's a collection of books put into a lot, which is important to remember because it took over 1,500 years to develop the Bible with over 40 different writers, and we're talking about lawyers, doctors, kings, you're just basic normal guy, all these kind of different people are writing this stuff. So the fact that this Bible is cohesive over this amount of time and this many writers is very significant. Now our basic Christian Bible is divided into two main parts: the Old Testament, of course that's before Jesus, 39 books, and the New Testament, that's after Jesus, that's 27 books, which gives us a total of 66 books. Now the Old Testament, let's talk about it for a second. The Old Testament is in essence the Jewish Bible, okay? The Jewish Bible is broken down into a few sections, okay? The Torah, meaning law, the first 5 books of the Bible, these are said to be written by Moses. Also the Muslims believe in the first 5 books, or the Pentateuch, meaning 5 books. And this is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. Those are your first 5. The second part of the Jewish Bible is called the prophets. That includes prophetic and historical writings. This is anything that has to do with history or any of the big prophets. The thing is, on the writings, the wisdom and poetry, they also include some prophets in there, okay? But keep in mind, even Jesus referred to this as the Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. They use different names in the Jewish tradition. We're not going to go through all those. It's really not necessary for you to know those. Just know that it's broken into 3 main sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the writing. And of course, since it's a Jewish Bible, they're still waiting on the Messiah, so there is no New Testament. So what about the New Testament? The New Testament's pretty simple. It's broken down also. Your Gospels are first 4 books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Second book, or the next book after that, is the Acts of the Apostles. That's the historical book. And pretty much the rest of the Bible there in the New Testament is the epistles, letters written to the churches and to people. A lot of these are written by Paul. They're called the Pauline letters or the Pauline epistles, but not all of them. Some are written by Peter, some written by James, John, so forth. And then we have apocalyptic writing, which would be Revelation. So the New Testament is broken into 4 sections also: the Gospels, the Acts, the historical section, the epistles, the letters, and the apocalyptic writing, which is Revelation. So let's get into how it's put together. Now this gets really complicated and really a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm going to cover it real quickly just to give you a general idea. Okay, first off, what is a canon? What does that mean? The word canon means a general rule of thumb, principle, or standard, a religious decree, or a body of religious writings. These are the actual technical definitions, okay? It comes from the Latin word meaning measuring rod or standard. So the Bible is canonized or put together into an authoritative structure. That's what we recognize today. When we say we have a Bible, we have a canonized version of the Bible. It's a compilation of books, remember that. So who set the standard and set the criteria for selecting the canon? Well, we can get into a lot of stuff. First, let's talk about the books that are left out. Okay, this is called the Apocrypha, often used in the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Bibles. And why are they left out? Well, the Jewish canon was trimmed during the time of Ezra, about 450 BC. There's a lot of details there. We don't need to go into details. But keep in mind, if this was trimmed down 450 years before Christ came, then this is not the Bible that Jesus would have used. The Bible Jesus would have used would have been the one without these books in it. Therefore, the Christians have decided that we need to use the book that Jesus used, the same Bible. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church went back to the original collection of books, the original canon of the Jews, and decided to put those in their Bible. So their Old Testament has another section called the Apocrypha. We won't get into details about why it's in there, why it's not. If you have more questions, ask us. Maybe we'll have more discussion about that. You can look it up online for yourself. Just give you a general overview here, okay? Because a lot of you are asking this question. What about the New Testament itself? How is it put together? Well, it took 400 years to compile, okay? Keep in mind, it started when Christ was born, which is basically 0, or plus or minus 4 years, The first collection of writings from Paul was put together in 200 AD. The Gospels were added along with other Pauline letters about 300 AD. And Acts and Revelation were officially added to about 405 AD. Now the important part here is these writings were collected just a few years after Paul was around. The difference being the Jewish collections were done many, many, many years after they'd been written. Okay, so these are the closest in proximity to when they were originally collected. Now, how do they know which ones to put together? Well, basically, they looked at the writings in, the different centuries, 400 AD, whatever the case may be, and they looked at all the writings that the churches were sharing. If you read some of the scripture, I believe Thessalonians talks about, once you've read this letter, pass it on to another church and another church. So these letters were compiled and passed along to churches, and they looked at the writings from those churches to see which writings were kept. And the ones that were mentioned most frequently, they put those together, they compiled them into what we know today as the New Testament. All right, let's go back to how they were translated, okay? There was a Greek version, was the first official translation that was allowed, I guess you'd say, and it's called the Septuagint. Okay, the original Bible was in Hebrews, but a lot of things happened in Greece, especially in the New Testament time. The New Testament writings were put together by synods. These are church councils. There are 4 of these church councils, 4 or 5, I don't remember exactly how many. One's in 393, one's in 397, there's different ones, different times. And these church councils would combine together, they would look at how the letters were being read by other churches and the other writings around these, and they would use those to combine what they thought to be the New Testament. Now, the Latin version was created by reviewing those earlier synods, and it was combined by Jerome, and it was called the Vulgate. Keep in mind, Latin was not necessarily the common language, so still the Greek and the Latin were still out there. They still were not allowed to be read by the common person. During the Protestant Reformation, they went back to this Vulgate and they tried to get it differently, and they took out and adjusted the Old Testament, I guess you'd say, to the Septuagint, which is the original Greek version. What they did is they took it back. This Latin version was created by the Pope, which was the Catholic Church, which I would assume would still have the Apocrypha in it. Okay, but during the Reformation time, the Old Testament went back to the Septuagint, which was the original Jewish version of the Bible that Jesus would have read. All right, English translations. When did it come into English? We always think the King James is the original English one, right? But in actuality, in 1392, an Oxford professor named John Wycliffe translated the Bible. You'll still see Wycliffe Bible translators. There's a lot of stuff they still do. But he was persecuted. His Bibles were destroyed, and they never existed. Anybody who followed him was persecuted. They were all pretty much gotten rid of, I guess is a nice way to say that. In 1520, William Tyndale translated it. Keep in mind, this is a translation by a person. He translated from the Hebrew and Greek text. But King James was not happy because he saw a lot of flaws in it. Now, I'm going to give you a very short version of a very long story. Basically, King James wanted to do some things that were not biblical. And so he authorized a version that was comfortable for him. A couple things I heard were trimmed in the original 1611 King James Version. There were some translations that were done that weren't necessarily proper. Like, for instance, one of the things they translated, instead of translating a virgin, they would translate that as a heifer or a young ox. And it made it a little bit easier for him to deal with some issues that he was dealing with in his personal life. Look that up for yourself. I'm not going to get into all that basically gossip stuff, but you look at it, it's historical. That was translated. The version we have today is better translated. We do not have that original version. When you pick up the King James Version at your store, just keep in mind that was originally translated to help King James do what he wanted to do. Okay. The key is to have a translation that goes back to the Greek and Hebrew. That's not translated from one of these English versions, which gives just a person their own version of it. Okay. Here's some other Bible translation. This is from notjustanotherbook.com. These are when the translation happened, and this is how many people it took to translate these things. So if you look at them, you'll see the CEV and the ESV, and we're going to talk about what those are in a minute. Don't worry about it. How many people, hundreds of people did it. The Amplified, only one person did it. They went back to the Greek, found their own version. Look at this one. You're probably familiar with the Message Bible. Well, of course, this is done by a person. It's a single person's translation of the Bible. Think about the new King James Version. 130 people translated back in 1982. The NIV was translated by 110 people. These are the common versions you're probably familiar with, the Revised Standard Version. And so you look at how many people translated the Bible, and did they go back to the Greek and Hebrew originations of the book? If so, they have a better copy, they have a better translation. I'm not saying any of the others are wrong. I'm just saying when it's translated by one person, they might have a slight twinge in the way they translate things. That's just common, that's humans. All right, it's not wrong. The Amplified Bible, I've used it a lot for my own personal study. to find what certain words mean, have the nuance of those words, and that's what this person was good at, is finding the Greek nuance of a word that we don't necessarily translate directly into English. The benefit of that is to have 3 different types of Bibles, okay? You have the literal type of Bible. They try their best to go word for word. The thing is, the syntax with the Greek and Hebrew is a lot different than the syntax of America. And so some of these versions, when you read the King James Version, it's hard to read because some of the words are kind of intertwined a little bit differently than what we normally would, how we would say it, okay? So these are your more literal translations. Your dynamic or thought-for-thought translation is in between these two. It's kind of the middle ground. They try to get word for word, but then when the thoughts don't make sense or the words are twisted, they kind of make them sound better and make them fit the thought for thought. Okay? The NIV's here, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the Net Bible, all these different Bibles are here in the middle. This is the dynamic translation. They're good for different purposes. Okay? Keep that in mind. The paraphrase version, I call it a modern retell. Alright? And this one, what they're doing is they're trying to get the nuance of what was said. So it's not a direct translation. It's kind of like if your pastor, if you took an NIV version, you ask him, hey, what does this verse mean? He explains it in his own words, so to speak. That's kind of what they're doing here with the New Living Translation, the Living Bible, some of these others, the Message, I told you about that. There's some parts of that where he says things that aren't in the Greek Testament, but if it was translated today, this is more like what it would say. And so you find the different versions here. If you're doing an actual study where you're going word for word and trying to sound out exactly what it means, these are good. If you're reading something, you want something that's easy to understand, you're just getting started reading, maybe a paraphrase Bible would be a good one for you, a modern retell. If you're kind of just you're doing your basic devotion, your basic Christian understandings, you want to start with these dynamic translations, okay? So hopefully this will give you a good idea of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the Bible. We're dealing with how it was put together and how we got it into our modern text. Which Bible is right? Well, that's just up to you. Do they say the same thing? Yes. That's the key. The message has not been changed. You can take the words, you can tweak the words, you can twist words around a little bit, but you got to be careful because it still has to say what God's Word originally says. Remember the original statement I said, this was written over 1,500 years by 40 different people. So they'll have their different nuances they're adding to that. But we got to keep that same thing happening here in our modern day, depending on what translation you're using. So depending on what translation you're reading from, you're going to get a slightly different version. But if you compare them, as a matter of fact, I have a Bible that compares 30 different versions of the Bible. Okay? And what it does, anytime they say something slightly different, it explains the differences. Okay, that's good to do. I always suggest having one of each of these to compare. This one helps you understand how it's phrased. This one helps you understand the thought behind it. And this one helps you understand the literal or the word-for-word translation of it. So hopefully this helps you guys, types of translations. If you like this video, let me know. Give me some comments. If you have some questions, put them down there and we'll cover it for next week. Have a great week, guys.